What if the only reason we stop embalming after midnight is because the body hasn't stopped yet? The cooler bank hummed behind me, steady as a dentist drill in the dark. I was already gloved, already gowned, already rinsing my forceps in the sink. Night shift in a funeral home is supposed to be boring. Boring is safe, and safe is the whole point. At 12:06, the transfer team rolled in a zipped pouch. The vinyl was cold wet with condensation and labeled in black Sharpie. I scanned the barcode, then scanned it again because I always do. Case packet matched, tag matched, seal matched. No family in the building. Time of death read 9:48 p.m. pronounced at the hospital. County release was clean, and the physician's signature was legible. The unwritten rule sat in my head like a splinter: no embalming after midnight. It wasn't in policy binders, and it wasn't in training manuals. Everyone learns it anyway, the way you learn not to touch hot metal. If you asked why, you'd hear the same answer: don't. I was alone because after 11:30 we run solo certification. One embalmer, one case, one set of initials on the log sheet. The phone at the desk showed no missed calls from my supervisor. I called him anyway, listened to rings and got nothing back. I signed the intake line because the schedule demanded a morning viewing. If I pushed it, the family would pay for the delay in daylight. In my world, delay means phone calls, complaints, and a report to the board. And board reports never care about your gut feeling. I dragged the pouch onto the stainless table and unzipped it halfway. Cold air spilled out, and the prep room smelled like bleach and metal. The room thermometer on the wall read 67 degrees, exactly as set. The compressor hum stayed, even like it was watching me work. I did the 6-point ID check, out of habit, not suspicion. Wristband, toe tag, pouch tag, photo paperwork, and my own initials. Everything lined up, which usually lets your brain relax. Mine didn't, and I couldn't explain why. I pulled the infrared gun from my apron pocket and aimed at the sternum. It beeped once sharp and cheerful, then flashed 38.6. That number should have been lower given the cooler and the time. I expected 38.0 or colder every single time. I checked the table surface, then the shoulder, then the forehead. Each reading stayed in the same neighborhood, too warm by a small margin. I wrote it down as variance, because variance is what we call discomfort. I told myself the hospital ride was short and the pouch held heat. I wanted that explanation to fit, so I kept moving. Routine is a kind of anesthesia when you're tired. I washed the skin with disinfectant soap and a stiff sponge. The body felt cool, but it didn't feel as cold as the numbers promised. I adjusted the head on a foam block chin, slightly elevated. The overhead light made everything look flatter, cleaner, less human. I laid out my arterial kit in the usual order, left to right. Scalpel, aneurysm hook, hemostats, forceps, drain tube, and cannula set. A lot of people think our work is guesswork and cosmetics. It's mostly measurements, timing, and doing the same steps without improvising. People who work near the dead live on one promise: the rules stay true. If a rule breaks, you don't have a script to follow. I chose the right carotid because it's predictable and efficient. I pinched the skin above the clavicle and made a clean incision. The blade met slick resistance, like the tissue was holding moisture. That happens, but not like this, not this far into the clock. I separated the fascia with blunt dissection and found the vessel. It looked normal, pale, and quiet, like it belonged to a body. I lifted it gently with the aneurysm hook and made the arterial nick. I expected thick, dark drainage, slow and reluctant like syrup. Instead, the blood that came out looked wrong in a small way. It wasn't bright, but it wasn't settling like post-mortem blood should. It flowed more easily than it had any right to after that interval. The metallic smell was sharper too, like it was fresher than expected. I didn't call it impossible because that word starts arguments in your head. I called it delayed coagulation and wrote it on the worksheet. I slid the cannula into the artery and secured it with ligature. My hands moved on their own steady like they'd done this for years. I opened the jugular for drainage and positioned the drain tube. The tray caught the runoff with a soft slap and the hum stayed constant. I reached for my stethoscope out of pure habit and stopped myself. You don't do that in a prep room because it's a stupid ritual. Still, my breath hitched once shallow before I exhaled it away. I told myself tired people feel dramatic about normal things. I connected the arterial line to the pump and checked my concentrate mix. Standard fluid medium index with a modest humectant add-on. I set the machine pressure to 18 pounds, exactly as my logbook preferred. The pump tone settled into a smooth note, too smooth, too steady. Normally you hear small changes when resistance shifts in the vessels. A slight strain, a slight flutter, a small complaint from the motor. This time the gauge needle barely moved, like the body offered no argument. The line ran clean, and the fluid went in like water in new pipe. That's not how a body behaves after hours in cold storage. You should fight it, massage limbs, reposition chase pockets of resistance. I watched the fingertips for blanching and expected it to take time. Instead, color moved quickly, even and quiet, like the system was still active. My jaw clenched hard enough to ache, and I loosened it deliberately. Clenching doesn't fix anything, and it never changes a reading. I leaned in and listened, not with tools, just with attention. No gurgle, no gas purge, no sign of decomposition pushing fluids. The hum of the cooler behind me stayed perfect, unchanged. That sound should have meant control, but it didn't feel like control. I paused the pump for a moment and checked for an obvious kink. Line was straight. Cannula was seated. Drain was patent and moving. I resumed flow and forced myself to log only what I could prove. Flow steady. Pressure stable. Distribution faster than expected. Here was the problem that made my skin prickle under the gown. If this was a simple variance, it shouldn't look so clean. The whole job depends on friction, on predictable resistance, on slow compliance. When everything looks perfect too early, it usually means something is hiding. No one believes us when we say the dead can break the checklist. They think we're storytelling or burnt out or trying to sound important. I checked the infrared reading again because numbers don't take offense. 38.6 again, and that consistency should have calmed me. Instead, it removed another excuse from my list. If the tool was wrong, it would drift, and it refused to drift. I wiped the probe lens and then aimed at the wrist, then the throat. The reading stayed stubborn, the same quiet warmth in the same places. The rationale part of my brain tried to build a ladder out of it. Maybe the pouch had been left out. Maybe the cooler door stayed open. But the cooler logs showed no door alarm, no compressor surge, no spike. And the room stayed 67 like a promise someone was keeping. I looked at the paperwork again because paperwork is the only witness. Everything was clean, official, and confident like death was settled business. My frustration flashed hot and brief, then burned out into compliance. I wanted to slam the clipboard, but I set it down carefully. I kept my hands moving because stopping invites thoughts you can't file. I adjusted the drain tube and watched the outflow with narrowed focus. The drainage wasn't sludgy enough, and it wasn't separating like it should. It wasn't dramatic, but it was wrong in the same direction as the heat. That direction mattered because it pointed away from equilibrium. Bodies should cool, thicken, stiffen, and give up, not cooperate. I kept my voice inside my head flat and procedural. No interpretation, no story, just steps and readings. I listened for the pump to change pitch as vessels tightened. It didn't, and that absence felt louder than noise. Not everything that stops breathing stays still. Sometimes it stays compliant, and compliance is its own kind of movement. I finished the arterial run without adding anything unnecessary. I clamped, capped, and secured the lines, then cleaned the field. Before I closed the incision, I took one last baseline temperature. 38.6, again steady, as if nothing had happened. I wrote the number down because the log is what survives you. Then I stared at the worksheet, waiting for it to look normal. It didn't. And the worst part was how easy it would be to continue. That's how you cross lines in this job quietly, on schedule with clean hands. The pump kept humming like it had all night, and the numbers refused to calm down. I had already written variance once, and that should have been enough. Instead, the body took the fluid like it was waiting for it. That was the part that didn't belong on any worksheet. At 12:21, I glanced at the clock and forced a timestamp. I always time arterial distribution, even on easy cases. It keeps you honest when your brain wants to coast. Color returned to the fingertips too quickly, too evenly, too clean. Through nitrile gloves, I felt warmth where I expected cold compliance. I told myself it was lighting and circulation patterns after injection. I rechecked the gauge and confirmed 18 pounds on the nose. The needle barely moved, and the motor never hunted for resistance. That kind of steadiness usually means the vessels are cooperating. Cooperating is not what the dead do after hours on the clock. They resist, they clot, they trap pockets, and they make you work. This one felt like a new house with open plumbing. I marked the distribution time anyway, because the log is evidence. Under 20 minutes from start to acceptable surface change. My expectation was at least 45 minutes even with perfect access. That should have been my first hard stop, and I knew it. But a hard stop needs a reason you can defend in daylight. Too efficient is not a defensible reason in this business. I checked for the most boring explanation I could find. Kinked tubing, wrong needle size, a failed check valve in the machine. Everything was seated unclogged and annoyingly correct. I reached for my dilution notes and confirmed the mix by habit. Standard index 1 ounce humectant per gallon, no extra dye. I hate dye because it hides what the body's actually doing. The drainage wasn't sludge, and it wasn't separating like it should. It was thinner than expected, and it stayed consistent longer. That consistency kept taking excuses away from me. I moved on to cavity work, because that's what the sequence demands. Arterial first, then aspiration, then cavity fluid, then closure. You don't improvise order unless you want a complaint on record. I pulled the trocar from the sterilizer sleeve and checked the tip. A sharp trocar bites with a certain feel like new drywall. This one was sharp enough to do what it was made for. I set the aspirator tested suction and listened for steady draw. The unit made that familiar wet slurp through the line. The compressor hum in the wall never changed. Abdomen first, because gas pockets tell you their own story. I made the puncture just right of the navel and advanced slowly. You feel layers then, a give, then open cavity. Dark fluid came back like it was supposed to, and I relaxed a fraction. That little moment of normalcy was almost a relief. Then I angled the trocar up toward the thoracic cavity. The resistance hit under the sternum like I pushed into concrete. The handle vibrated once, then went dead in my palm. A dead stop is not how a chest cavity feels. I backed out a half-inch and tried a new angle, more lateral. Same stop, same depth, same hard refusal. My brain tried to label it as calcification and move on. But calcification doesn't behave like a wall. It crumbles, it gives, and it does not stop a trocar cold. This felt like the heart was not an organ anymore. I withdrew and checked the trocar shaft for bends or burrs. Nothing. Clean steel, clean marks, no damage at the tip. I switched to a second trocar from the drawer without thinking. Same entry, same angle, same hard stop beneath the sternum. The aspirator kept pulling useless against whatever I was hitting. I stared at the depth ring because the depth ring doesn't lie. At that moment, I had one sane fallback left. Call someone, put another set of eyes on it, and document. So I walked to the desk, called my supervisor again. The phone rang into nothing, and the clock ticked 12:34. I let it ring longer than I should because I needed a witness. No answer. No voicemail pickup. Just the deadline and the hum. People who work near the dead learn the same lesson early. The system only respects what can be logged and countersigned. Everything else becomes your private problem when daylight arrives. I opened the policy binder to the section we all pretend to read. Solo certification after 11:30. No delay without director approval. Delay triggers family notification and liability exposure under our state board. That wording isn't about care, and it isn't about truth. It's about timelines money and keeping the funeral rule complaints away. So I went back to the table because I had no procedural exit. I redirected aspiration around the obstruction because that was still allowed. Stomach, intestines, bladder then, as much thorax as I could reach. I documented resistance at cardiac area and kept it bland. I injected cavity fluid through the same puncture, slow and measured. 2 bottles standard volume per our internal ratio chart. If you change ratios, you leave fingerprints on the outcome. I sealed the puncture with a trocar button and wiped the area clean. The body looked calmer than it should after that much intervention. That calm felt like another contradiction I couldn't name yet. I shifted to feature setting because that's what comes next. Eye caps in mouth former seated, then mandibular suture if needed. The sweet chemical smell of cavity fluid sat in the air. The eyelids relaxed open a millimeter while I was working. It was not a dramatic opening, just a slow release. I closed them again and pressed gently until they stayed. A few minutes later, the eyelids did it again, same tiny drift. That drift was small enough to blame on moisture or adhesive failure. It was also the second time, and repetition changes the meaning. I reset the caps and used a fresh strip of adhesive, no shortcuts. Then, I resecured the jaw with a tighter bite block placement. I logged muscle compliance variants and forced myself to move on. This is the part outsiders never understand about our job. We can't stop every time a body behaves oddly on a table. We'd never finish a case, and we'd never keep our licenses. So I made myself chase the last rational explanation I had. Equipment fault, ambient shift, or refrigeration inconsistency at intake. That meant rechecking temperature again like a machine. I cleaned the infrared lens aimed at the sternum and waited. The beep sounded too cheerful for the number it returned. 39.0 A rise during cold exposure. Airflow in the room felt the same, and the wall thermometer stayed steady. No heater kicked on, no door opened, no compressor changed pitch. I wrote anomaly number 3 and circled it once. No one believes us when we say a body can move in the wrong direction. They assume we are tired, careless, or trying to sound dramatic. So we swallow it, log it, and keep working in silence. I checked the cooler bank temperature logs on the wall panel. The system showed stable readings and no door alarms since intake. The machine gave me nothing to blame. That removed my last comfortable excuse, and I felt it immediately. The case wasn't getting stranger by theater. It was getting tighter by subtraction, like a trap. I stood at the sink and washed my gloves, even though it was pointless. It was something to do that looked normal for my own benefit. The hum stayed steady, and the lights stayed unforgiving. Back at the table, I ran my fingertips along the forearm. The skin felt more pliable than it should, given the time. It wasn't warm like living skin, but it wasn't settling either. I did not say that out loud because words make this real. I just adjusted the arm position, checked for pooling, and moved on. If it was nothing, it would stop giving me data. It didn't stop. When I checked the fingertips again, color still held in a clean way. The distribution looked like I had perfect circulation on a fresh case. That thought landed wrong and stayed there. My frustration flared once sharp and brief, and then I shut it down. I pressed the clipboard flat and wrote slower, cleaner, more controlled. Anger doesn't help a body behave more like a body. I looked for procedural reasons to pause, and I found none. All I had were measurements that pointed the same direction. Away from equilibrium, away from decay, away from my training. Not everything that stops breathing stays still, and that includes numbers. Sometimes the numbers creep upward while the room stays cold. Sometimes tissue resists as if it knows what you are doing. I finished the feature setting with extra care and no extra flourish. Every adjustment was logged because logs are the only shield. Then I stood there, hands still listening to the hum. The last thing I did before moving to the next step was recheck time. 12:49, and I was already behind schedule for morning prep. That meant I would have to keep going no matter what I felt. I wrote the timestamp, closed the binder, and kept the case moving. Because at this hour, procedure is not guidance. It is gravity, and it pulls you forward, whether you agree or not. The pump shut off with a soft whine, and the cooler bank kept humming. I stared at the gauge like it could apologize. The needle sat where it always sat, calm and correct. The numbers on my worksheet still said the body was drifting warmer. That had already happened twice, and I kept working anyway. That was the part that bothered me, not the readings. Exhaustion makes you accept things you would challenge at noon. I pulled the ligature tight and finished the final suture. The thread bit into the skin with the usual dry resistance. I trimmed the tail, wiped the incision line, and checked for seepage. No seepage, no purge, no obvious mess to blame. The body looked finished, dressed, and stable under the lights. That should have been the end of it. I ran my infrared check one more time because I had to. The device chirped and flashed 39.0 again. I held the sensor steady, then checked the clavicle and wrist. Same neighborhood, same direction. Not rising fast, but not falling either. In a room set at 67 that still made no sense. I wrote the time down with slow, careful strokes. 1 o'clock was gone, and morning staff would arrive at 6. The viewing was scheduled for late morning, and the family expected calm. I opened the caseboard and confirmed the next required step. Refrigeration transfer, tray tag log entry, and door seal check. At 1:02, the system authorized the move without any flags. That was the line you cross in this job, and nobody warns you. Once you transfer a case, it becomes a clean, institutional fact. It becomes harder to argue with than your own memory. I hooked the tray to the lift-checked wheel locks and rolled slow. The hallway was dark except for exit signs and a camera glow. The hum followed me through the walls, steady and indifferent. I checked the cooler door keypad and entered my code. The latch clicked and the door seal thumped as it released. Cold air hit my face like a slap, sharp and dry. The internal display read 38 degrees, exactly where it should. I didn't trust it, so I checked the secondary gauge on the panel. Same number, same stability, same quiet confidence. I slid the tray in and aligned the rails left and right. The metal scraped once, then settled into place. I scanned the tray barcode and listened for the confirmation beep. Beep. Logged. I stepped back, checked the door gasket for gaps, and closed it. The seal thumped again, and the hum never changed. That should have been the end of the anomaly. Cold storage is supposed to erase variance, not create it. Instead, the case felt like it was waiting for the next reading. I walked back to the prep room and cleaned instruments by sequence. Trocar forceps aneurysm hook, needle injector, then the hose fittings. I logged disposal weights, wiped down surfaces, and bagged contaminated waste. In my line of work, routine is how we keep our minds intact. People who work near the dead survive by trusting the checklist. Once that trust cracks, you start counting hours instead of years. I made myself sit at the desk and read the policy binder again. Not because I needed guidance, but because I needed an excuse. If there was a clause that let me stop, I would use it. There wasn't. The language never mentions biology or uncertainty. It mentions scheduling obligations and regulatory exposure to the state board. It mentions family impact refunds and complaints filed in writing. I wrote a neutral note in the internal log and kept it short. Temperature variance observed. Equipment verified. No mechanical faults detected. That sentence was a kind of surrender. Before I left the building, I checked the cooler display one last time. 38 degrees steady with no alarms on the panel. The hum stayed smooth like it had nothing to report. I drove home as the streets emptied and the sky stayed black. My hands smelled faintly sweet despite the soap and sanitizer. I slept badly and woke before my alarm. At 6:45, I was back in the building. The hallway fluorescents flickered once, then steadied into flat white. The air felt drier in the morning, like the night had been erased. I went straight to the cooler bank and entered my code. The latch clicked, and the seal thumped with the same weight. Cold air poured out, and the internal display still read 38. My eyes went to the tray before anything else. It was not centered on the rails the way I left it. It was shifted several inches, angled slightly toward the door. That should not happen in a locked cooler on fixed runners. Trays don't drift uphill, and they don't pivot by themselves. The wheels were still locked. I leaned in and checked the tray stops with my fingers. The metal was cold enough to sting through the glove. The stops were engaged, and the rails were intact. I slid the tray out slowly and watched for snag marks. There were none, no scratches, no burrs, no evidence of impact. The shift looked clean, like it happened without friction. That was my first small reveal in daylight, and it held. If a coworker had moved it, they would have left a mess. If the tray had slipped, the rails would show it. I pulled my pen light and checked the body position without touching. The right shoulder sat lower than my last placement. The chin looked slightly less elevated, as if the head had settled. Settlement happens, but not like this, not with embalmed tissue. I could see faint compression lines at the shoulder seam of the gown. Those lines looked like sustained pressure, not a quick shift. I swallowed once hard and forced my focus back to procedure. Photos, log check, and temperature review in that order. If I skipped steps, the case would become my fault automatically. I snapped 2 documentation photos on my work phone and saved them. Then I pulled up the cooler temperature graph on the wall panel. The line was clean with no compressor faults and no door alarms. The graph still showed incremental rises overnight, small but consistent. Not enough to trigger an alert, but enough to match my notes. In a stable 38-degree unit, it should not trend upward. This is the shared pain point we never talk about publicly. We expect cold to pull every body toward the same endpoint. When the numbers climb instead, you lose your last safe assumption. I rechecked with my infrared gun because I needed a second witness. The device chirped and flashed 38.9 at the sternum. That was still too warm for how long it had been inside. I checked the cooler readout again, hoping for a simple failure. 38 stable no-fault codes, no cycles logged. The machine gave me nothing to argue with. I felt my jaw clench tight and involuntary. Then I released it. Clenching doesn't change temperature and it doesn't change policy. It just reminds you that you are still a person. I rolled the tray toward the prep room for final grooming. The wheels clicked over the threshold strip at the door. The hum faded behind me and the lights buzzed overhead. I adjusted the collar, checked the lip line, and set the hands again. Gloves on fingertips light no unnecessary pressure on the joints. Embalmed tissue should hold position when you place it. This one held position, and that was worse. It meant the shift in the cooler wasn't normal settling. It meant something applied and maintained pressure for hours. I printed the release forms and placed them on the clipboard. The paper rustled under my fingers, dry and thin. The ink from my pen bled slightly, as if the room was too cold. The forms were routine authorization cosmetics, acknowledgement, viewing, release. Signing them makes the case official, clean, and unchallenged. It also makes you responsible for what you chose not to report. I hesitated for one beat, then signed anyway. If I escalated without proof, I risked my license and the family's peace. If I delayed, the viewing would collapse, and the blame would be mine. No one believes us when we say a body can violate the system quietly. They hear it as drama, or burnout, or an attempt at attention. So the institution teaches you silence without ever calling it that. The chapel was ready by 9 lights, softened flowers, arranged in symmetry. The air smelled like floral solvent and furniture polish. Everything looked calm, which is what families pay for. I watched the viewing begin from the corridor, out of sight. People moved in lines, spoke in whispers, and trusted the scene. The body stayed still, perfectly compliant, like it wanted to pass. That compliance felt like another kind of movement, and it stuck with me. Not everything that stops breathing stays still. Sometimes it stays correct until you stop watching. I left the building after cleanup and wrote one last private note. The note wasn't about fear or mystery or anything dramatic. It was about temperature trends after midnight in stable cold units. Weeks later, I turned in my keys and kept my explanation short. I told them the hours were getting to me, and that was true. I never mentioned the graph. I still think about one detail from that night because it never fit. The temperature rises were small, but they happened at regular intervals, like a schedule, not a drift. And if that's true, then the rule makes a different kind of sense. After midnight, the system can still be wrong. Not everything that stops breathing stays still. If you work anywhere near death, you already know some rules exist for reasons nobody puts in writing. If this story stayed with you longer than it should have hit like, so it doesn't disappear quietly. Subscribe if you want the stories we're not trained to explain. And in the comments, tell me this one thing: at what point would you have stopped the procedure?